All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the JavaScript document object model, otherwise known as the DOM. We're going to talk about what is the JavaScript DOM, how to manipulate the JavaScript DOM, how to write JavaScript within our HTML document, connecting an external JavaScript script to our index HTML, and then we'll talk about our different ways of grabbing elements within the DOM rather than iterating through the entire document. We're going to go ahead and talk about the DOM document.get, different types of selectors, and then the document query selector versus query selector all. Does anyone have any questions over what we'll be covering this morning? All right, awesome. I'm going to go ahead and open up a main.js file here as well, just that we have it available for us as we manipulate through this DOM, because I like to make an example of this object. So I'm just going to go ahead and make this quick object here named document. And this object, we're going to make it, let's go over to GitHub. It should be a good place to manipulate over the DOM per se. Actually, probably won't be. Let's go to the Poke API. All right, so here we have the Poke API, which we've seen already a couple of times. Actually, we've only seen it once, but today we're going to go ahead and utilize it to explore what the JavaScript DOM stands for. Now, the document object model, there's this nice little picture here. I'm going to go ahead and bring it over that we have in our curriculum, and it's very popular to describe the DOM in general. You'll see that it essentially falls kind of like a tree. They give this example of a tree with separate branches, but it's a branch that's upside down. Inside of the document, there's something like the root element, which is the HTML file. Within there, there may be two elements which fall as the head or the body, et cetera, as they continue to fall down. All right. Now, in these elements, there may be some titles. Let's take a look here. As I open the inspector tools, and I come over to my console so I could actually write some JavaScript code, I'm going to clear all these messages. Inside of the browser, in JavaScript, this is already preset inside of every browser for us to be able to interact with websites in a reactive manner. I can type in something like document. And you'll see that the entire screen becomes highlighted when I write this document. Right? The entire screen is highlighted because when you utilize document, it is referencing to everything that is currently being rendered. Now, if I put dot, you'll notice that a lot of different attributes fall down. So again, document dot, and I have all of these different attributes that fall below. We're not going to cover every single one of these. We will cover some, but know that there's a ton of different functions and attributes that you can actually interact with within the DOM utilizing JavaScript. Now, after I type in document, I'm going to go ahead and go into the body. And you'll notice that if I flow over the body, it tells me that what I've selected is everything within the body tag or the body of my actual HTML element. So again, let's go document dot body. Now, inside of the body, you may think, oh, well, maybe there's a header, maybe there's something like main, because if you take a look at this, so far, it looks pretty similar to what we have on index.html, right? The document is everything within HTML. I am now within the body tag, but maybe I want to access something like the header. Well, that's not going to be as simple as me typing in, as me typing in dot header, because it's not going to recognize that. That doesn't become something that's inside of this object, so it returns undefined. So far, what this object looks like is document, then it has a body key with other attributes inside of it. So now instead, in order to be able to grab everything inside, what we need to go into is children. And you'll see that in children, when I go ahead and log this in, I get back an HTML collection of 14 different items. If I open this up, you'll see that it is an array of different items. So here we see a non-script, a division of root, a couple of other scripts, an in-frame, so on, until finally we get this div of root down below. And that's what highlights the remainder of our application. Now it's starting to get a little bit too complicated for us to interact with. So let's go into index.html and take this to live server. All right, so index.html, it's pretty simple. We have an HTML document with a simple head where the title is JS DOM. We have a header element, a main element with a paragraph tag, a footer element with an H3 tag. Same thing, we can go ahead and open up my inspector tools, come over to the console, can type in document.body, and I can go into the children. You'll notice that I'm able to access the children both within square brackets and as a dot element. Why is that? Why am I able to access that in both ways?
Is it because it's like an object?
Yeah, because in reality, it's just a simple object, right? Inside of the body, we have a key named children. And in this key named children, we have an array of key object value pairs. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this over. You'll see that we have this header, this main, this footer, and a script. Even though we don't have a script tag, it's still generating one for us. So in here at index 0, we have header. At index 1, we have main. And at index 2, we have footer. Right, so all these elements were created, they're happening, they're in there. All right, so one more time, document.object, or excuse me, .body, .children. Pass this over, I get my HTML collection, and the script is present. We don't really interact with it because there is no script currently being rendered, but it's just telling me, hey, this might be present in there. It's just something that's happening by default from running it in live server. All right.
So if you want to just pull up the header by itself and nothing more, could you just have like a zero index at the end of
Yeah,
children?
perfect. Yeah, so if I wanted to pull up the header but nothing more, I could just go into the 0 index. All right, so in the 0 index, I may have something that looks like this. There is a header object that also has children. And in this children, if I take a look here, the only child that it has is 1, which is an H1 element. And that H1 element is an object that has inner HTML that is equal to an H1, or excuse me, that is equal to JS DOM. All right, so if we were to iterate through this, we would go document, oh, excuse me, dot body. That gives me the body that we're highlighting there. We have children within said body. I can access the 0 index to give me back my header. You'll see that it's highlighting the header now. Within the header, I also have other children, which at index 0 return back that H1 element, and you'll see the H1 element is now being highlighted. And inside of that H1 element, there's inner HTML. Oh, which I totally just mixed up. There you go. Inner HTML, which returns this JS DOM. All right. And that's essentially what the JavaScript DOM looks like. It's just object, or as I like to say, everything in web development is just boxes inside of boxes. Right? As you open up one key, it opens up the box to another object. Does anyone have any questions about how to iterate or how to visualize and move through the JavaScript DOM?
So with the boxes, how do you know when it's time to split off into its own box? Like you have the document one, right? It goes all the way down to header, and then header is its own object, and it goes down to H1, and H1 is its own object. How do you determine when that split should be?
How do I do? Oh, I see. So what I like to do is also drawing it out, right? So for example, here, let me go ahead and open up a new one. And let me do this here. So here we have the body. Inside of the body, we have a header. We have a footer. Then inside that header, we have an H1 element. Inside main, we have a paragraph tag. And then within the footer, we have an H3 element. So that kind of helps us visualize where this breakoff is, right? So the body has 3 boxes inside of it.
Okay, I see, and that can change depending on the website.
Yes. And that can change depending on the website. All right, so that has three boxes inside of it. From there, we picked the first child, which only has one H1 element. Oh. So that's what we basically did when we iterated through.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions?
Maybe I just like blanked out, but the main.js file, is that just for like demonstrational purposes right now to show us like what we're doing? Or is there a purpose to that?
Yes, that's just the demonstrational purposes for now. This, as of right now, this is not connected to our actual HTML script, nor is it functioning in any form of way. This is just me writing out what's going on within the DOM so that we can visually interact with it and actually see some code to connect the dots.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. All right. I'm not getting any questions regarding the DOM. So with that said, I have a question for you all. How do I interact with the DOM to be able to iterate through all the elements inside of the DOM and grab the inner HTML of my H3, which is this is a footer. I'm gonna go ahead and come over here. And I'll have everybody help me out getting to that place there.
You do the document dot body,
All right, awesome.
and
And let's pass it
then
off to someone else now. Thank you so much.
A child of two.
Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child of two. Child or children?
Children? Children.
Got it. So we got children at index 2. Perfect. Let's
And
pass it off.
children. Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. Now let's pass it off to someone else that's giving me the footer. What's next?
Dot footer.
Okay, let's enter there. You're saying dot footer. That doesn't return anything. So what else could it be?
Dot inner HTML.
All right, so if I do dot inner HTML, that doesn't necessarily return the correct output that we're looking for. We're just looking for it to return this is a footer. So there's
Oh.
something missing.
Dot
Dot
H3.
H3. So it's going to be dot children 0.
All right, let's run this. Let's run this part here and let's see what's in here. So if I open that up, it looks like this is an element that has a child inside of it that contains an H that is essentially an H3 that then has inner HTML. All right, so now that I've taken a look at that, what would be the next step here?
Would it be dot
Children
H3?
0.
Let's go ahead and pass it off to Jack here so I could hear one person at a time. Go ahead, Jack.
Would it be dot H3?
No, because H3 isn't an attribute in the DOM. All right, if I take a look at the DOM and I take a look at these attributes. So currently right now, what I've entered was the footer, and the footer would essentially look something like this.
So another dot children.
Perfect. So now I'm going to go ahead and add a dot children. Now it's giving me back an HTML collection. All right. What would go in there? Let me go ahead and pass it off here and let's hear from Rachel.
Open up the HTML tag. Like, didn't you just run the one above it?
So I just ran this document.body.children at index 2.children. So that returned an array of elements.
Yeah, if you click on the arrow, does it open? It doesn't give you anything else. Then I would grab the 0 index.
Perfect. So now we grab the 0 index. All right. And let me go ahead and pass it off to Kenny from here.
Dot inner HTML.
Perfect. From there we go dot inner HTML. And that gives me back this is a footer. So now we were able to iterate. We grabbed the document, the body. We then looked at the children within it, grabbed index 2, which gave me back the footer. Within the footer, we had an attribute of children, which was an array. From there, we grabbed index 0, which was the H3 element. And the H3 element contained an object with the attribute of index HTML, which said, this is a footer. All right, I'm going to open up the floor for questions a second time. Does anyone have any questions over how to iterate through and interact with the JavaScript DOM?
I got a question. So, as like a developer, what is the purpose of iterating through like a JavaScript DOM on a website for like us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the purpose as far as being able to iterate through the JavaScript DOM, right now, iterating through it isn't necessarily going to be a hard skill that we are going to need. It's important for us to understand the layout of the JavaScript DOM. By interacting with it, we're mainly going to do it through selector queries, which we're about to dive into right now. Now, what that allows us to do is to create dynamic sites, and we're going to see an example of that here in part 1 before we go into our break. I just need a little bit more time to get to it, Chase. All right, and I see the thumbs up. Perfect. With that said, let's go ahead and dive into, now that we understand how the JavaScript DOM is kind of laid out and iterating through, let's go ahead and go into selector queries. Excuse me, everyone. All right, so here I have a p tag. This p tag, I'm going to go ahead and Um, I'll keep it. I'm gonna keep my p tag here.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't remember here. Oh, never mind. Never mind. Never mind.
Oh, all good. I will take it. Perfect. All right, so as of right now, we have these paragraph tags, which I'm going to go ahead and add to all of them a class. In these paragraph tags, I will add a class of classic text. And then inside of my header, I'm going to go ahead and add an ID of header text. Now, let's go ahead and go into something called query selecting. There's a couple of different ways of grabbing elements. You can grab elements by ID. You can grab elements by their tag name. And you could also just grab elements by class name. Now, there's a couple of different ways that they function. Now, when we talked about IDs and classes, when we were talking about CSS, something very important that I mentioned was that IDs are only to be utilized for unique elements. IDs will always be utilized once. If you find yourself utilizing the same ID on multiple elements, then this shouldn't be an ID. It should be a class. So I just want to make sure that that gets clarified. And this is one of the most important parts for it. It's not only just to make sure that your CSS is clean, it's also because you'll run into issues when writing your script tags or writing your JavaScript that will interact with your index HTML or with your HTML elements. So here, if I go into the elements that are currently being rendered, you'll see that inside of my header tag, I still have my ID of header text. Inside of my main tag, I have these classic text. All right, let's go over to the console and see what power does that give me? Well, here, if before when I wanted to grab that JavaScript header, I had to iterate through the entire DOM and essentially work my way down through the document object model this way of going through the dictionary, grabbing each individual child. And although that works, it's a kind of a hassle. If I didn't want to do it that way, we needed a more efficient way to be able to select elements or find elements within my website. So in order to do that, I type in, oh, I totally messed that up. I go ahead and type in document dot get element. And you'll see that I have a couple of different selectors here. The one that I like to use the most is get element by ID. Now, when I get element by ID, all I need to do is specify the name of the ID. In this case, what I have is header text. And you'll notice that when I run this, it automatically returns that H1 element. All right, I could save this to a variable. I can say select did text be equal to document dot get element by ID. Header text. And then I could grab the inner text within this tag. And you'll see that it gives me JS DOM. Then I can do selected text. There's a couple of different things that I can do to interact with this and change its color. So let's go ahead and do something like that. I'm going to go ahead and do document dot get element by ID. Pass in header text attribute or argument. And then I can say, hey, well, I want to change the style here of color to be equal to red. And now when I did that, you'll see that the JavaScript DOM, its style attribute, access the color attribute of that specific element and changes it to red. So there's the get element by ID. Does anyone have any questions over how get element by ID works?
Dumb question going backwards. So when you're using the document tree model to pull up like document.body.children and all that, you were still using the console to do that?
Yes, I was still
Okay.
using the console.
All right.
Awesome.
Maybe.
Assuming,
Sorry. Go ahead.
Jack. Nope.
Go ahead, Jack.
My question, so the header text, like that's the ID, but I guess like what are the IDs? Are they like the children?
IDs, I may be misinterpreting. I'm not sure where this question is heading to. When you type in get element by ID, what happens is this script will look through the entirety of your HTML file, all of it, everything within the document. And what it does is it returns an array of IDs.
Okay, gotcha.
All right, awesome. So then when you pass in the argument of header text, it iterates through that array, finds the header text, and returns the element, in this case, which is our H1, that is attached to set ID. All right. And then Chase.
Yeah, quick question. I assume like because header text is an ID, I'm assuming if you do like get element by class, it'll throw an error.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a great question. Let's go ahead and try that out. So if I try to do document dot get elements by class name, and I pass in header text, well, you'll see that it still returns an HTML collection, which is an array, which is what I expected. In this case, I am not selecting one single element. I am selecting elements by class name. It still returns an array. In this case, it just wasn't able to find anything that shared that class. Now, if I was looking at classes, so for example, I was looking for classic text, and I run that code, so document.get elements by class name, and then I pass in classic text. Well, now when I execute that block of code, it actually returns 3 separate paragraph tags, all of which have the same class of classic text. All right. So get element by class names returns an array of all those elements sharing the same class, while get element by ID will always return 1. All right. And then same thing vice versa. If I try to do get element by ID and pass in classic text in here, it's going to return null because I won't be able to find any that have classic text. All right, and I think I saw head nods earlier, but does that answer your question, Chase? Just in case? Perfect, head nods.
What about the variable you created? Selected text.
That is still in there.
Yeah.
And if I go through it again of selected text, it will still return the JS DOM. It's
Can you,
saved into the console memory.
but can you manipulate the properties of that element by using that variable instead of using get elements by class or get elements by class ID or class or get elements by ID? Is there a get elements by like variable equivalent?
Yes, there is. So that's a great question. So I could grab the H1 element here, and I can do that by saying document.get element by ID. And then I can pass in the header text. All right, that will give me the H1 element altogether. And now I can say, hey, H1 dot inner, I can say inner text is equal to hello Zulu. And you'll see that it changes to hello Zulu.
So then using the variable we created before selected text, you could do the same thing.
Selected text was a little too in-depth. So selected text is already set all the way down to the inner HTML. So I can't access the attributes of it. But what I can do is just say, make it equal to, so selected text is just saved to a string at this point. It's no longer attached to the DOM. So if I
So
change
it's
it
not a
to
reference to an
signify,
element. It's just a value.
exactly.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? All right, perfect. Let's go into the next type of selector here. So now the next type of selector is going to be the query selector, or excuse me, the tag name. So if we go to get elements by tag name, so I can say document dot get elements by tag name, I can pass in a simple tag of a paragraph tag. And when I do so, it returns my HTML collection of all of my paragraph tags. Now this can be utilized for any tag name. I can pass in main. You'll see that it returns one index in my array. I can also pass in something like, hey, I want to grab all of the H1 elements, and it will return the header text as my 0 index, right? So it will return an array of all the instances of the tag that you are looking for. All right, does anyone have any questions over the elements? Get elements by tag name.
Yeah, so since you already like did change the inner text of like JS DOM or Hello Zulu by using the class name or ID or like the class or ID, I'm assuming if you do by tag name H1 and you try to change the color to like a different color, it wouldn't work because the selectors of class and ID are higher like level.
Got it. So what you're thinking about is when it comes to CSS hierarchy, what we're looking at here is just JavaScript as it's being executed. And as we know, JavaScript is a runtime language that runs from top to bottom, right? So if I do it by grabbing it through a selector, so document.get elements by tag name, and then I pass in tag of H1, that should give me an index 0. At index 0, that's going to return the header. And then if I change that to style.color, I make that equal to blue, it would work and still turn it to blue. Because this is just JavaScript, it's going from top to bottom. Whatever is the last line that gets executed is what gets rendered on the screen. CSS hierarchy doesn't apply,
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
of course. All right. Any other questions regarding get elements by tag name? Perfect. Let's move on into our last two types of query selectors. So here we're going to do document dot select, or excuse me, this one is going to be query selector. Now, query selector is unique in the type that you can run pretty much any argument in here. If I go ahead and pass in p tag, you'll see that it's going to return the very first instance of a paragraph tag. All right, go ahead and pass this over. Because it's only supposed to return one, it returns the first instance of something. Even though there's multiple paragraph tags, it just finds the first one and returns it. Now, I can also do something where I pass in a ID. So in this case, I can pass in header text. And you'll notice that it returns that H1 element. All right, the query that I passed in was an ID, and it knows it's an ID because I placed that # in the very front of my document. Now, same thing could be said. If I wanted to pass in a class, I could pass in classic text with a period, just like it would be identified in CSS. And even though there's multiple instances of that class, it finds the very first one and it returns the very first instance of it. And that is the power of the query selector. It is always going to return one item. If there is multiple items, it will return the very first one it finds. And if there's only an ID, it will return that one ID instance. So I strongly recommend that if you're working with query selector and you're trying to interact with just one independent item, such as an ID, that's where query selector is more applicable, or I guess the appropriate tool that you should be utilizing. There is something where we can grab the entire collection called query selector all. And in query selector all, when I pass in classic text, it now doesn't just return one instance like it did before with just query selector. It returns a node list, which is just a list of all of the paragraph tags that have the class of classic text. So query selector all will always return an array. Query selector will always return one HTML element. Query selector will return the very first instance of whatever the query is, while query selector all will find all of the instances of said query and return them within the array. If there's only one, it is going to be an array with only one item within it. Does anyone have any questions with query selector or query selector all?
So I guess the document.query selector, if you're selecting a class, like a class, like classic text or a statement paragraph text, and you say you don't return the first one, could you index to like the second one if you wanted to? Or is that just not possible? It's either the first or all. You can't do like one in the middle, for instance.
So once you do query selector all, that returns a list, right?
Yeah.
So here we see
Yeah,
a
but
list.
what if you just want to do like the second one? Is it even possible?
Yeah, then you just do index one.
Okay. So it's still possible. So that's how you would get around it.
Yes, so that's how you go within it, within its return value, and grab the specific tag that you want.
So in that case, when would you want to use query select all compared to get element class, which would just do the exact same behavior?
So let's go ahead and do something like this. Let's go into GitHub, and if we fall into GitHub, we see these little boxes inside. Let me find a better example here. If we were to think about something like Facebook or Instagram, where we have repeated blocks of code, right? I log in for every post. Let's say these are posts. There's going to be an image with text inside of it. A like button, a comment button, and I'm not really sure what else there's going to be in there, right? But this is what I can think of off the top of my head. Now, a post isn't just one specific item. There could be multiple instances of said post. And let me make sure all of that gets highlighted. Now, for these posts, if I were to write some script that when a button gets clicked, maybe I want a different theme, right? Right now, they're all on light theme or something that shows white and black contrast. But if I wanted all of them to change to where a specific contrast was being activated, or a selected few to change to where a specific contrast would be activated, I would want to select a collection of them, iterate through the collection, and change their information appropriately. Now, this is just an example. This could also be accomplished by just grabbing the class and switching the styling of the class. But this is the example that I could think of about how to manipulate it with just the DOM iteration. Does that answer your question there, Kenny?
Somewhat, but I'm still confused because doesn't query select all and get element by class do the same behavior? So it sounds like it's just semantics. or if you want to be more specific in one direction or another.
Got it. I see. I maybe misunderstood your question. So you're saying when should I utilize query selectors versus the other tools that we just came over of grabbing it by class name or grabbing it by ID? It's definitely just different tools. They're all inside of your toolbox. It doesn't really change your efficiency regardless of which one of the two you decide to use.
Understandable.
All right. Awesome. Perfect. So now that we went over a couple of different ways to interact with the DOM, let's go into some actual application of this information. Currently, I just emptied out my JavaScript DOM here, or excuse me, I just emptied out my body. Now I want to actually write a little bit of a script where as I enter information, I want to update what's being rendered on the screen. So in this case, let me go ahead and enter or create an input field. This is going to be of type text. And this input field is going to have a placeholder of write your name. I am going to give it an ID here of user input. And I'm going to close my tag. From there, I'm going to add a button. This button will say submit. Notice this is not a form. This is just a simple input field with a button attached next to it. Now I want to write some JavaScript. So far, I've been utilizing the console and it's been working out great. But instead of utilizing the console, I actually want to add a script tag, some JavaScript into my HTML that will get executed once my HTML gets rendered on the screen. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to write a script tag. Now in the script tag, that's going to allow me to actually write JavaScript inside of HTML. The reason why I'm placing it in the footer is because I want my entire HTML document to render before my script tag becomes executed. I like putting it within the footer to emphasize that idea, but you could also just put it at the very bottom of your script adjacent to the footer. All right. Now in here, I want to know that this is connected. So I'm just going to do something very simple to allow me to know that this is connected. I'm going to get element by ID, and the ID that I'm going to grab will be header text. I will grab the style, the color attribute, and change that to red. Okay, great. Let's see what's happening. So when this browser gets this index.html, it renders my entire body. It renders the header with no styling inside of it, renders all of my main content, it then renders my footer, and then finally it gets down to the script. When it gets down to the script tag, it grabs the element by ID of header text, style, and color, and changes it to red. Now let's see what happens if I change this order. What happens if I take off the script tag from the bottom and I place it up top? Well, now you'll notice that I'm not rendering anything, and I'm actually getting an error within my console. Let's take a look at this error. So in this error, I'm getting cannot read properties of null, reading style. Interesting. Why is this happening? Can anybody take a guess as to where this error is coming from?
You're calling the ID before it's created in the HTML file.
Perfect. I'm trying to access something such as get element by ID header text, which doesn't exist. It has not yet been created. It is running from top to bottom because the header element has not been generated or created. This get element by ID is returning null. So when I try to access style, it tells me, hey, the null does not have a property named style. Awesome. And that is why our script tags go at the bottom. So now I know my script is working correctly. Everything is being rendered the way I want it to. And now I'm simply just going to write a function here. I'm going to add another header tag here. I'm going to make this an H2. Actually, let's make it a paragraph tag. And I'm just going to give this the ID of output. Now, my intent is that the user will be able to write in their name, and when they click submit, their name will populate right above within that paragraph tag. Let's make that functionality. We're going to make a function here of submit name. This function is not going to take in any parameters. And what it's going to do is it's going to grab the value from our input. So let's say user input. And I'm going to make that equal to document.get element by ID. Let's just call this field. And what I'm going to grab will be the ID of user input. I will then grab the output field, which will again get element by ID and pass in output. All right. So now I grabbed both of those fields. I'm going to grab the output field and make its inner HTML, or let's say inner text, I apologize, be equal to the user input field dot value. From there, let's actually console.log it for now before we even go any further into this. Let's just console log the user input field, and then let's console log user input field dot value. The value attribute is an attribute that falls to the input field specifically, and what it's going to return is whatever is entered inside of said input field. Now I have this function, but I need to connect it to an event or something that happens within my HTML document. We'll be talking about events more in depth during part 2 of our lecture. But for now, let's go ahead and add an on-click listener saying that, hey, when this button is clicked, I want you to trigger my submit name function. Let's see what happens here. I'm going to refresh my page. I'm going to type in Francisco. And I'm going to click my button. Well, when I clicked it, you'll see that the very first output at index line 25, so here's my console.log of user input field, returns the entirety of the input field. And my console.log at line 26, which is just grabbing the value, returns only Francisco. Does anyone have any questions about this function so far? All right, doesn't seem like we have any questions. With that said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my output field, set its inner text to be equal to my user input field value, which should be Francisco. And then I'm going to reset my form. I'm going to grab the user input field dot value and make it equal to empty quotation marks yet again. Then I'll console.log function is complete. I'm going to refresh my browser, type in Francisco. I'm going to submit. Francisco populates into my paragraph tag, which is what we expected from line 25. We grab the output field, which was the paragraph tag there. We set it to the value within the input field, which was Francisco. And then we reset that input field to be back to empty quotation marks. And then finally, we get this function is complete. All of this happening within my script tag. Does anyone have any questions about this?
Is there a purpose to putting the script in the HTML file over the JavaScript file, or is that just like for demonstration purposes?
For analysis for demonstrational purposes, I am going to demonstrate how to put it all within main.js here shortly, but you do want to put them all separately. All right. Any other questions? All right. It seems like that was a pretty straightforward thing here. So let's go ahead and transfer all of this to main.js. I'm going to go ahead and take all that I wrote here, going to exit it and place it within this JavaScript file of main.js. Now, how do I attach it? Because as of now, I already know it's not connected because JS DOM is not in red color like we wanted it to be in line 1. So if I come over to index HTML, I still have the script tag. I could just add a source attribute. And in this source attribute, I can map it to main.js. And now in doing so, my script tag will grab main.js and essentially just inject it to fill it in and execute the code. Now the same concept stands if I switch this to the very top of my body. I'm going to get an error because I'm trying to grab something that does not exist. There is a way to work around this, but I just want to make sure that it's clear to everyone that the reason why this is happening is because the elements have not been created yet. Now, the workaround is adding the argument of async. By adding the argument of async, it's going to work properly. Now, what async means, and you could even add the defer attribute if you wanted to. And essentially what this is doing is it's saying, hey, I want this script to be executed asynchronously as my HTML document. Well, what does that mean? Let's put this up side by side. So my JavaScript starts being executed. Or excuse me, my HTML document starts being executed. HTML happens, the head is created, gets to the body, and then gets to the script tag. The script tag says, hey, I want this to happen asynchronously. Great. Well, now because we're in this script tag, it's going to pause here, take a look at the JavaScript, and go into line 1. Line 1 says get header text by get element by ID. Well, that doesn't exist. So because it doesn't exist, it comes back and it continues. It goes into the header, renders the H1 element of header text, realizes, hey, this exists now. Now it goes back, executes the JavaScript, comes back, creates the function. Notice that the function is not being called, and then finishes the JavaScript. It then picks back up and continues to render the remaining of our body. That's what asynchronous is doing. It's essentially saying, hey, I want you to run both of these at the same time. If you run into a stump in one or the other, looking within each file and find the appropriate code or execute the appropriate code until you're able to continue the other, right? It's just happening asynchronously at the same time. Where the example that we had before without the async defer would have crashed because we were trying to grab an element that didn't exist and we didn't tell our HTML document to wait or to continue to create elements to be able to fill it all in. Does anyone have any questions over how to connect an external script to your HTML document?
Couldn't you
If
just
you,
put that same script tag in the head tag, to go along with like your CSS document as well?
Can I put my script tag in the header tag? I
Yeah,
can.
literally copy paste that and put it in the head tag. Yeah.
Yes, I can. The way it's actually executed or the way it's read doesn't necessarily work this way. I would put it within the body just for conventional purposes. I would very much preferably put it at the very bottom after the footer. At that point, what we're talking about is semantics.
So is the reason why you can put all that JavaScript code inside the HTML and have it work? Because is it because in the DOM it all in general just becomes JavaScript?
That's a great question. So the very first iteration of the internet was just index HTML. It was just HTML pages being connected to one another. As the internet grew, they decided, hey, we need a way to be able to interact with websites, make everything more dynamic. So there was essentially a consensus or just a hostile takeover where JavaScript became the language of the web. So now the web or just the internet in general is designed to be able to work with JavaScript. And that's why HTML documents now, you can specifically tell it, hey, script tags will hold JavaScript inside of it. And it's already kind of like a pre-programmed feature because it knows that it's the language that you're going to be utilizing to make dynamic websites. Does that answer your question, Kenny?
Yeah, in a sense. So now the HTML language can handle JavaScript essentially wherever you put it, because in the button you're calling a function.
Yes, that's correct. I think there's a lag between your audio and your video because I think there was a follow-up to what you were saying, and I might have missed the second portion of what you said. But yes, essentially you can connect the JavaScript with your HTML because it knows that's how you make dynamic sites. It's just a pre-programmed feature between the two. All right. Any other questions?
One quick one. So it's kind of safe to assume to put all your scripts at the bottom of the page, like in the footer.
Yes, I would put them at the bottom of the page, either within or adjacent after the footer. All right. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So this is going to conclude part one. Let's go ahead and take 30 minutes to do a little bit of a practical application. You can go ahead and pause our recording here. All right, welcome back, everyone. Now we have our JavaScript script running. We're a little bit interacted with what exactly is going on inside of our HTML document. Let's go ahead and dive into our elements now. I want to make sure that we're able to create elements, and we'll even go into how to create elements that have their own events inside of them. So let's go ahead and dive into that. How do I create HTML elements? Inside of this same HTML document, I'm just going to go ahead and add a couple of divisions to organize our HTML file here. I'm going to add another division, and in here, I'm going to add a div named container. And then I'll add a button for generate card. Now, inside of this container, what we're going to do is we're going to generate just a couple of different cards. And I'm actually going to give it some styling here, just so that it's already there. You make it display flex. Add a little bit of styling. All right, so there's our border right there. We could see our division being created, and I do have that gap on the left-hand side. I know why that's happening. It's happening because currently my body itself has a border, so I'm just going to go ahead and fix that. There you go. So now we can see we have our body being rendered. It is at 100%. And we have our nice little container there being displayed. Maybe I want to add a margin to this. Let's make it 5 even. Instead of making it 100%, I'm gonna make it 80. There you go. A little bit more reactive. We can see what's going on here. Let's go. Perfect. We have this division of container and I have this generate card. Every time I click on this generate card button, I want a card to be generated inside of that container. Great. Well, how do I go ahead and do that? How can I make a function that would create a division that would be a card? Well, we can make all of the styling for a card here. Let me go ahead and make a new JS file, or excuse me, a main.css file here. And in this main.css file, I'm just going to add the class of card. Now, I know this is going to be a division. I'm just going to go ahead and make it a height of 25 pixels. Let's make it a width of 10 pixels. We'll add a border being solid. Again, we'll do black. And let's make the border 1 pixel long or in width. And we'll go ahead and add a nice little border radius to make it somewhat round. All right, so there's our cards that are going to be generated. I have the class of card. I'm going to go over to index.html, and I'm just going to add that link tag there. I'm going to say link, relationship, style sheet, and it's not a source, but it's an href to main.css. All right, great. Actually, now that I have this information here, I might as well take all of this content out. Get rid of that style tag. And just enter container. All right, so it doesn't seem to be working as far as connecting it. Let me go ahead and stop the port. Let me click it to go live one more time. All right, so that is not working. Now the question is why?
If the CSS file is in the same folder, shouldn't it just be main.css?
I could do that as well. It's still routing to the same one. Let me see what is going on here. I'm getting errors. Oh, there it is. There's my error. Relationship style sheet. Easy peasy. Little mistakes will add up. It's all about the little stuff. All right. So now everything is linked together. I know that my footer is connected because I see that it's or that my CSS is connected because I see my footer is now in color blue. I have this container that has now been generated. Now I simply want to create cards inside of my container. Well, I'm going to create a function here named create a card. So const create card. Now this function is going to grab the container, and I could utilize get element by ID, but in this case, just to have something different, I'm going to use query selector, and I'm going to grab container. Now, I'm going to create a card. And in this case, I'm going to go into the document and I'm going to create element. Now, when I want to create an element, all I need to do is specify the specific element that I want to create. I want to create a division element. This division element will now have a class. I'm going to make that equal to card. That's what I named it in CSS. There we have a card. So now the class name has been added to the card. And I can finally just say container dot append child, and I can add a card. All right. We grab the container that we've generated. We then create a division element with JavaScript. We set that division element class to a card, and we add it to the children, because as we know, container will have children, which is an array. We're just adding to that array a new card. All right. Now to plug in the dots, here in this button of generate card, I'm going to add an onClick listener or an onClick event of create card. Let's see what happens now. You can see our cards being created. The more I click it, the more cards are created. And let me go ahead and change a little bit of the styling here. That's too much. All right, so there's a little bit more styling. Let me go ahead and add a gap element here as well, just because I don't want these to be so close to one another. There you go. As we generate cards, our container will continue to fill up and stretch out to generate more and more cards. All right. Regardless of the CSS, I don't want us to focus too much on the CSS. I want to focus on the JavaScript. In here, we're grabbing the container. That's giving us this black box up here. We are then generating a new division element by utilizing the create element function, adding a class to this element of card name, and then adding the card to the container. Does anyone have any questions about this?
Is there any essential difference between when you were adding the class using container.className or card.className equals as opposed to card.classlist.add?
Sorry, could you ask that question one more time? I want to make sure I understood it.
Sure. You have new card.className equals card. Is there any real difference between doing it that way and doing new card.classlist.add card? That's just typically how I add a class to an object. I've never used .className equals.
That's a great question. Yes. So you could definitely use the method that you mentioned. When you utilize the method that you mentioned, it brings back a list. And if you want to add multiple classes, then you want to do it in the way that you just mentioned by grabbing the list of different classes and then adding a new class, right? When you utilize class name equals, that's assigning a class for the very first time. So this is meaning that that array is empty. So I'm just placing this as the very first class. If I wanted to add a separate class, then I would utilize a separate method that you mentioned. So new card dot list
Class list.
class list dot add.
Yeah.
And then I could put a different class. So let's say second class. And then here, do second class, background color. So now when I generate a card, it has both of the classes. The first one where we assigned a class by class name, and the second where we're grabbing that list and now adding classes into it. Does that answer your question, Tim?
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Got it. As far as a fundamental difference, the main reason why I wanted to introduce us for classing, that's going to be the syntax that you'll see in React.
Oh, okay.
All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, your border is growing as you add more, as you generate more and more cards. It's not just, why is it growing that way?
That's happening because of the height. I set it to min height, meaning that if it needs more height than the one that I gave it, because it has too many elements, instead of trying to squeeze the elements, it's just going to give me more space to generate more cards because I don't have a max height or a set height.
No, he's talking about the border around the cards. It's getting thicker.
Oh, the border around the cards?
No, I was talking about expanding because
Oh, okay.
I'm copying your
Okay.
code and mine's not doing that, so I'm just curious as to why it didn't happen.
I'm not sure. That min height attribute should have done the trick.
Okay. Oh
As
no,
far
no, I figured it out.
Oh, perfect.
Unregard, thank you.
Of course. All right. So now we figured out the second class. We were able to add some attributes into it, and we're able to generate HTML. We can also do something like create an image. Let's say that we want to do something like that. I want to show an image. We can do this division. In here, I'm going to have a button saying show image. I'm going to give this an ID of image containing. So now we know how to create elements with JavaScript. We know what attributes fall into an image, and we know how to select different information from here. So as a class, I want you all to walk me through the process of being able to generate an image into this division element.
I would add for the button, adding the attribute on click equals, let's name the function show image.
All right.
And then we'll create the function in the JavaScript file.
Easy peasy.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and let's pass it off to somebody else now, Kenny. Let's hear it from Jason. Belt.
Okay, let container or let image container, but let's say img, and then maybe capital, yeah, like that. And then equals document.query selector. And then we'll throw the ID of the image container in the quotes. You want me to keep going?
No, let's pass it off to Jack.
Okay.
I'm honestly not really sure.
All right, pick somebody to pass it off to.
We'll go Chase.
So you need somewhere to put the new image. So create a new div, basically same as line 13, saying new image equals document dot create element. And then you could do, I think you could do div, because you want to be able to contain the image you're going to put in.
Okay, so am I creating an image? What am I creating?
A div, sorry.
All right. And then pass it off to someone. What's your next step?
I'll do Morty.
Maybe div.source and add a URL. I really don't know.
Okay, and let's add a URL there. Let's do ditto. Why not?
Wouldn't dot sorts be giving div an attribute when we would want to create a element of anchor
Hmm.
inside div?
Well, it's pretty close. I think there's a little bit of a mix up here as to creating a div. Do we want to create a div, or is there a different HTML element that we would want to create? And I'm gonna pass this one off to Stephanie.
Image, img.
Perfect. So let's change that up. All right, so now we have an image. We created that image with the correct source. What's the next step?
And the image to the image container.
All right, so image container dot append child, and let's do image. All right, let's see what our JS DOM will do. I'm gonna go ahead and show image. It's not giving me anything. Let's check what our console is telling us. So cannot read properties of null for append child for image container. So where did I go wrong here? What could possibly be the issue?
Did you call it by the wrong ID name?
Perfect. And there you go. We were able to identify that we grabbed it by the wrong ID name. And when we click on show image, it now gives us our nice little image of Ditto showing up on JavaScript. Fantastic. All right. That's going to be it for as far as how to generate elements utilizing JavaScript before we dive into events and creating elements with events. Does anyone have any questions over how to utilize JavaScript to generate elements or make your sites more dynamic? All right, perfect. In that case, let's go ahead and go into adding new events. For this generate card, currently right now when I generate a card, it's just generating the card itself. But it's not really showing me anything when I hover over said card. As you can see, I can generate as many cards as I want, but if I hover over them, nothing happens. Maybe I want to add a little bit of a event where when I go over each card, not only does it turn yellow, but maybe it increases the height and width of this element. So let's go ahead and dive into that. How can I do that? Well, what I can do is I can add a new event to this card. So I can say, hey, let's go ahead and add event listener within JS. I can say new card is going to have an event listener. And I can specify the event. The event that I want to specify is going to be mouse over. On mouse over, I want to analyze the event, and that is going to take in a function. Now, all I want to do is console.log that event for now. There's a couple of different attributes that I want us to talk about here. I go to generate a card. Once I mouse over, you'll see that a new message was populated. I get a mouse event. It tells me, hey, this is a trusted event. There was no buttons. Here is the element that it came from. It came from this division container. On this X and Y axis is actually telling me where in the screen it happened. It gives me a little bit of a related target there for the division. And it even gives me a target. So if I console.log event.target, I go to generate a card, I hover over it, you'll notice that it console.logs a card. The entire card element gets placed into my console every time I hover over this card. The event is happening within the card, so it is the target where it's coming from. So that's how we access the event itself. There's a couple of different attributes that fall in there. We'll talk about it here shortly. So now I'm able to grab the target, where that's coming from. So I can say selected card, or I can say event.target.style.background color. And I want this to be equal to yellow. I go to generate a card, I hover over. Well, I was able to select the target, which was the division element. I grabbed the style component and added a background color of yellow. If I go to generate more cards, you'll see that the rest of them don't have that same styling. Well, as I hover over them and continue, all of them will be highlighted as yellow. All right. Let's go ahead and access the other styling of changing its height and width. I believe as of now, its height is set to 15 vmin and 8 vmin. So let's do 16 and 9. So in this case, it'll be 16 vmin. And let's grab its width and make that to 9 vmin. We'll go over these vmin later on once we start talking about responsive design. For now, you can take a look at it if you would like, but don't worry too much about the units of measurements. I'll go ahead and generate all of my cards. Now, when I hover over one, it also turns into a bigger card, letting me know that they are cards that I've hovered over. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we created this new card add event listener when we generated our card element?
My JavaScript may be a little bit rusty, but what event are you passing in? Are you passing in as a parameter on line 16?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the event is a parameter. What the event is, it's hard to explain. It gets interpreted as an object. And essentially, the event that I'm passing over here is a mouse over. So when I tell it, hey, the argument is a mouse over, it waits for me to drag my mouse over this card. And when I drag my mouse over the card, that's how I get this mouse event. So I'm console.logging the parameter of event. Here on line 16, the parameters that I'm passing, there's two parameters. I'm passing mouse over, which is the name of the event, and then a function as to how to handle this event. So I can say const, or I can make a new function. Handle mouse over that will take in an event and then conduct the following. And that way, when I create a card, instead of writing it all out in here, what I can do is I can just pass in handle mouse over. And it will all still have the same behavior. All right, so I'm passing in two arguments. One of them, the name of the event. And the second argument is the function that will be triggered when this event happens. The event that I'm passing in is a mouse event. It's happening when it's mouse over. And it's giving me all of these attributes that I can interact with within the event. The type of event that I'm using is a mouse over event, and that is what I'm specifying in that first parameter. Did that answer your question, Kenny?
In a sense, so the event listener, if you put mouse over, gives you an object for the second argument?
Yes. So the first one is saying, this is the event that you're listening for. The event I'm listening for is a mouse event that is going to be triggered upon a mouse over. The mouse event gets passed into my second argument, which is the function, and it gets passed in as a parameter.
Okay, I guess the part I'm also confused about is that in line 23, you don't have anywhere to pass in the argument. So how does it know what argument to take in, or is it just automatic? I'm honestly maybe rusty on my JavaScript.
Got it. So that's happening from the add event listener. The add event listener will take in the mouse over event, right? Once it has that object, it knows that its second parameter is going to be a function that will accept this event. If it does not accept the event, it will raise an error.
Okay, now I see. This is more stuff that happens under the hood with the method add event listener. That's okay. Now I'm starting to see how this works.
Awesome. All right. Any other questions?
So I guess what if we wanted to have the mouse highlight the container, only make it yellow and change the size when the cursor is over it, and then when the cursor is removed, have it go back to how it was?
It's a great question. Let's go ahead and do that. How would we create that functionality?
You could do the mouse out.
All right, so there's a mouse out event. So let's do new card. We want to add another event listener. This one will be a mouse out. All right, and then for my second parameter, I'm going to create a function. What's this function going to do? And let's go ahead and pass it off to Noah for this portion.
Essentially, everything you have in the function handle mouse over, you're going to revert back to whatever it was initially.
All right, so let's grab that information there. Let's paste it. So instead of yellow, you're saying to turn it back to white, or essentially null, but we'll leave it for white. And then turn this to 15 and turn this into 8. Okay, well, let's see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and generate my cards and take off the console. And now as I hover over them, okay, they turn yellow. And when I move out, they go back to their regular size and go back to their original size as well with color. Awesome. Did that answer your question there, Jason?
Yeah, I guess in a way it kind of feels redundant to have to essentially repeat the logic a second time, for mouse out. I mean, is there an equivalent function where it just, you just do it one time for an event listener and you run the mouse over, and it turns the L, and then you remove it away, and it removes it. Besides just repeating the same code.
You could
Could
put
you
them
use a
both.
board?
Sorry,
Oh, I
could you
guess
say that
hover
one more
would.
time,
Yeah, I guess
Jason?
hover might be the answer.
Oh, did you say hover?
Yeah, yeah, maybe that would do the job as opposed, instead of repeating yourself by adding another event listener.
Hover would work as well. The main purpose behind this code is to show the functionality and how it works, but there's definitely hundreds of ways that you could accomplish this output. All right. Any other questions? Okay, great. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions, so let's go ahead and dive into our next concept here. And our next concept, what we're going to talk about, is going to be event propagation. So let me go ahead and add a couple of boxes here again. Generate code, show image, do this right here. All right, and let me go ahead and add a couple of classes here, or add a little bit of design here. All right, and all right, so there's our boxes there. We can see we have our outer, middle, and inner boxes. And let me actually add a little bit of padding here as well. Oh, let's see, outer. So we could see it a little bit more centered. There you go. All right. So there's our boxes. We have three separate boxes, one inside of the next. Now there is such a thing called event propagation. And we're going to talk about this event here shortly. Let me go ahead and see what we have here. All right. I'm going to add a couple of functions. So there's two functions of say hello and say goodbye. And I'm going to add these functions inside of this outer and inner loops here shortly. All right, let's go over to index.html. I'm going to have this outer have an onClick function of say goodbye. And I'm going to have my inner have an onClick function of say hello. Now notice these divisions. Let's go into our console. And see what happens when I click on the innermost division. I click on the innermost division and I get both hello and goodbye. Let's refresh the page. If I click on the outermost division, I only get goodbye being rendered. Interesting. But when I click on the innermost division, I get both hello and goodbye. Why could that be happening?
Is it because the hello is inside goodbye, but goodbye isn't inside hello necessarily?
Perfect. Yeah, that's a really good description. So let me go ahead and just have our middle and our outer. We don't really need an inner anymore. I click on the middle, we get both hello and goodbye. I click on the outer, I only get goodbye. Okay. And the reason why that's happening is because it's nested. Well, what if I didn't want those events to be triggered on both elements? I didn't want there to be a propagation of this event. Well, I can go into my main.js and pass in event. Now, say hello is attached to my innermost division. Let's see what happens when I add this event dot stop propagation. And let me just make sure I spelled that correctly. I did not. That's why I have to double check. Well, now when I click on the innermost division, cannot read properties are defined. I'm getting event. Ah, there you go. I have to actually pass in the event as well. All right. Now I click on the most inner division. I'm still getting that community is not defined. HTML on click 17. There's a good chance that I have to actually spell out event for HTML. There you go. All right. So inside of your index HTML, you actually have to spell it out all the way, saying event. It's a reserved keyword, so it needs to be able to recognize it. So you need to actually pass in and spell it out, the word event. If you just pass in EVT, it's going to unrecognize that variable. So make sure you pass in event. Here in the say hello, what we're doing is we're telling it, hey, I know that you are a nested element and that there's another event that could be nested. It is an on-click element that will happen at the most junior level. So in this case, because it's happening within the inner box, it never migrates to our outer box. So now I actually have to click each box individually. And that's propagation. Does anyone have any questions regarding event propagation?
What if you wanted your say hello function to run when you clicked on the outer box? So like instead of when you click on the inner, it displays both hello and goodbye. But what if you, for some reason, you wanted, when you click on the goodbye box, it displays both that and the inner nested function?
So that's not going to be a propagation issue. At that point, what you have is an element issue of the way they're nested. So you would just have to put it within this function of goodbye to also grab the element of the inner element, the child element, and trigger its event, and you'll have to do it through JavaScript code. Does that answer your question, Chase?
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. Thanks.
No problem. All right. Doesn't seem like there are any other questions.
I do have one actually. I want you to go back to the index.html.
Of course.
Is it necessary to define class holder again in line 17? Like because you defined it in line 16, would it automatically be applied to the inner div?
Are you saying to remove this class and that the class would
Yeah, because I'm just saying like, because you already have class holder defined in 16, would it be redundant to repeat yourself in line 17?
No, because I want to actually be able to see that box. So you'll see how if I remove it, I have the outer box, but I still need to be able to see the inner box. I can't see
Okay.
it.
Okay, so the class doesn't necessarily get applied to the inner divs
Yes,
necessarily.
they're
Still have to
not
define separately.
right. They're not inherited like that.
Okay.
All right. Awesome. So there's our divisions. The last portion that we're going to be talking about today is going to be forms and how to handle said forms. So here in my main, I'm going to add another division. And this div, I'm going to add a form. And we'll talk about how to handle form submissions here shortly. I'll go ahead and add an input field for the ID of what is your favorite color. So I'm just going to put favorite color. I'm going to put name for color. And I'm going to place a placeholder of favorite color. Gonna pretty much add the same input field here, but instead of color, I'm going to do name. Let me just make sure that I didn't have that in my other one. Okay, nope, I turned it as user input. Great. And then finally, I'll add an input of type submit. All right, so there's my form. Now I just simply want to demonstrate this output inside of this division or inside of this paragraph tag. Let's go ahead and do something like this. Give it the ID of form output. All right. Now, we talked about this different input field down below, where if I put Francisco and click submit, it'll generate it in that Francisco. And the logic that we're about to write is going to be pretty similar, but it works a little bit different when you write it inside of a form. You'll notice that when I write it inside of a form, if I click on submit, it's going to send information to the URL pattern. If I put Francisco and I put the color of red and then I submit, it sends those arguments to my URL pattern, which that is the built-in functionality that comes in with the browser. But that's not necessarily the way that I want this form to work. I want to take control of this form. So the function that I create, it's going to prevent the default behavior that is built in with my form. So let's go into that. So I'm going to create a handle submit that will take in an event. And the first thing I want to do is I want to stop the default behavior. And that is going to be done with the prevent default argument. Now let's add that to our form. So on submit, I want the handle submit function to be triggered and take in the event. Okay, everything, we're going to refresh it, put Francisco out of the color red. And now when I click submit, it's not refreshing my page. None of the arguments or parameters are being sent to my URL. And I'm not changing the values from within my form. So now I stop the default behavior from the form. Great. Let's continue moving forward now. Well, how do I grab this form data? Let's go ahead and say, well, I want my form data. Let form data be equal to new. And this is a different data structure called form data. And we're going to grab this from the event target. Let's take a look at what the event target actually returns. All right, let's do it again. Francisco, red, submit. And the event target just returns the form itself, the entirety of the form, with all the input field and its current values. Now I'm passing it into this new form data. Well, what does that look like? Let's console.log this form data. Francisco, red, submit. All right, so we get that entire form, which is my event target. And then we get this form data, which we see it as a prototype of form data, and it has a bunch of different attributes inside of it. Not really something interesting or something that I can use as of now, but maybe there's an extra step that I can utilize to make this form data into an actual object. When I can say let, or I can just use variable reassignment, but to make things less confusing, let's do form object be equal to object dot from entries and pass in form data. And now let's console log this form object. Francisco, red, submit. Well, in the first portion, we still just get the entire form attribute. But if you take a look at the second portion, we took that form attribute and turned it into an object of key value pairs, with the keys were the property of name and the values being what was actually inside of the input field. Now, when I say the property of name, I am referencing to in the input fields, we pass in name. So name of color turned into a key, name of name turned into a key as well. And that's how we get that object with key value pairs. Does anyone have any questions about that so far?
Can you go back to the JavaScript file?
Of course.
So the new form data that I think you just went over, but like to confirm, that's creating an object from the data that you're putting in that form?
No. So this is creating a separate data structure. That separate data structure has a couple of attributes that we can interact with, but it's not really something that we can use. But we need this step to turn this HTML, because as of right now, event.target is just a form HTML. But we need to turn it into JavaScript. So we pass it into this new form data so that it breaks it from being an HTML document and turns it into form data. And then from that data structure, we create an object. Does that answer your question, Chase?
Yeah, so it just translate HTML pretty much into JavaScript.
Exactly. Kind of like a middle step to getting to our object.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. Well, now that we have this information, let's go ahead and finish off our project here. So we have this UL, or this unordered list of form output. So let's grab that. Let's grab let ul be equal to document dot query selector of form output. And then let's create a couple of li items. So let's say for let key in form props or form object, I apologize. What we're going to do is we are going to add, so let li be equal to document dot create element of li. We're going to say li dot inner text is going to be equal to, I'm just going to add an interpolated string here. I'm going to pass in the key. And then pass in the actual value. Then finally, at the end of it, I'll say ul dot append child li. All right, let's see what this does now. Go Francisco, go red, submit, get name undefined. Interesting. Let's do this instead. There is not a there you go. Now we get name Francisco and color red. Was accessing that object incorrectly. All right. Does anyone have any questions over this? So just do a quick recap over forms. We, one, stopped the default behavior of the event, which was resetting the page and sending the information to our URL. We capture the event, pass in the entire form to this form data structure. This allows us to then create an object from said data structure that has the key value pairs for the input and name of each one of these input fields. I then grab that unordered list of form output. I iterate through the keys inside of that form object. And for each one of those key value pairs, I created a list item where the inner text was the key and value pairs. I then appended that list item to the unordered list. And that's how we get Francisco, red, submit. Here's the key, and here's the value. Just like we see on line 58. Does anyone have any questions over how to handle forms in JavaScript?
What if you wanted the name and the color on the same line?
What if I wanted the name and color on the same line?
Yeah. So you have two different bullet points, one for name, one for color. What if you wanted them all just in one line?
Then I
One
would
bullet point.
I would probably do it like this. So you're saying in one bullet point, right?
Yeah, as opposed to how you have it as two different ones.
Yeah. So then I could say li.inner text be equal to, and then say, oh, but I didn't know the key value pairs. Interesting. So then let's say inner let my text be equal to string. I would not create this li item here because I already have it. I would move this append child outside. And then I would say my text plus equals Francisco, red, submit. Oh, that was close. That did not work. Correlate key, my text.
Maybe you have to just assign like an inner text or inner HTML.
Oh, that will do it. Thank you. Inner text be equal to my text. All right, let me do that. Oh, there you go. How to brainstorm a little bit. Thank you, Jason. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Doesn't seem like there are any other questions. In that case, I'm going to stop our recording here.